What makes an RPG combat system good? Does it need to be fair and balanced? Is it more important for the fights to be fun and balance be a secondary factor? Maybe you think combat needs to have a lot of variance so the fights don't get repetitive. Of course, it's not just one factor, but a mix of all of them that goes into good, maybe even great combat systems. Unfortunately, Tales of Arise misses the mark on almost all these factors, and its combat falters because of it. Repetitive enemy types, bosses with too much health, and a lack of fleshed out progression mechanics are but a few of the key mistakes this game makes. Before we dive into the combat, let me explain the main parts of the game so it's easier to follow. This won't be a total retelling of the story, as I'm not here to critique anime writing, just RPG combat. You play as Iron Mask, a dude who wears an iron mask. Please don't forget this part, it comes up later. He is a Danon, not the yogurt, which is a race of people, indistinguishable from humans, who are slaves to a technologically superior race of people called Renans. One day when Iron Mask is tasked to load a train, a group of Danon freedom fighters blow up the train and capture a prisoner on board. You end up helping them fight off Renan soldiers and join up with them as they interrogate the prisoner. You find out she is a Renan woman named Xion, and she is on the run from other Renans for a reason she won't share. After your cave hideout is found out by Renans and all hell breaks loose, you find Xion and fight with her. This pair forms the first two party members of the game. It turns out Xion is wanted by the Renan Lord of the country you're in because she stole his Master Core. It's a device that holds astral energy. Xion pulls a burning sword from the Master Core, and Iron Mask can wield it because he doesn't feel pain. But just because he doesn't feel pain doesn't mean the burning sword doesn't damage him, so Xion has to use her Renan healing magic to heal his burns after he uses the sword. The plot is set in motion when Xion states she wants to use the sword to kill the 5 lords who rule over the planet, which is a plan the enslaved Danons can get behind. On this journey, you find more characters to join your party, which eventually reaches 6 members. These 6 members and their abilities are really important to combat because you're actually able to play as all the characters, not just Alphen. Oh yeah, his mask broke a bit and you remembered his name is Alphen.
Alphen. My name is... Alphen!
I said it was going to come up. At most, you can have up to 4 characters on the field at once, but you can swap between those 4 at any time, even during the fight. The other 2 are in reserve, and they can even use their boost attack, which is something I'll go over later in the video. Now that we know the basics, let me explain the party that you have as you play through the game. Alphen is your generic all-around fighter archetype. He is sort of tanky with big sword abilities, and his unique role in the party is that he can sacrifice health to use the burning sword for large fire attacks that deal increased damage to knock down foes. Xion is the second party member, and she fits the marksman role. Where she differs is that she's a Renan, and as this game explains, only Renans can use magic, so she's also your mage. She can cast both offensive spells of different elements as well as healing magic. Your third party member is, very quick plot twist, a Danon mage named Rinwell. Her party trick is that she can store her channeled spells. Cast another spell and she will use the charge to cast a higher level spell, even if you haven't learned that spell yet. There are even unique spells you can only cast as a combination of other spells. Rinwell gets very limited support spells though, and none of them heal, so she's almost purely offensive. Law is your party's monk, using melee combos on enemies without being hit to boost his stats. He also has abilities that do stuff, I guess, but his main attacks are like super forgettable, and I had to look up what he did to actually write this part, I'm not gonna lie. Kisara is the 5th party member who joins, and she has a big shield. That's it, moving on. Dolheim is the 6th character, and is very interesting since he is actually a Renan Lord, and since he's a Renan Lord, he can also cast spells. Most importantly, he's the only character besides Xion who can cast healing spells. He has a hit and run playstyle where he dives in and out of the fight while casting big magic attacks. Combat in Tales of Arise is fairly easy to understand. It's made of basic attacks, arts, which is this game's version of a skill, a dodge roll, boost attacks, which are basically super moves designed to counter certain enemy types, mystic arts, which are similar to limit breaks, and finally boost strikes, which are a combo ender that executes the enemy. These systems work well together and form a fun gameplay loop of beating on an enemy with different arts, dodging around, attacking some more, and finally finishing them off with a boost strike. Boost attacks are an additional layer to this. As I said before, they are made to counter certain enemy types, and if you use them successfully, the enemy is knocked down and you can wail on them with your best attacks. At the best of times, combat feels fast and fluid with visually exciting combo enders. Using Kisara's shield to stop a charging enemy, stealing an enemy's spellcast with Runwell, snaring fast enemies with Dolheim, it gives you a sense of skill and satisfaction in the frantic battlefield. However, these feelings are few and far between, and you are much more likely to feel bored and annoyed after fighting the same enemies for far too long, in a game without enough interesting progression mechanics to keep you interested in battles on a longer scale. By the last act of the game, I was running away from all non-mandatory fights because I know it would be the same fight I had done a million times, and I wouldn't earn anything worthwhile in the fight anyway. Combat feels trivial for a few reasons, and let me explain those in some greater depth here. The first issue is apparent after just a few fights. The enemies have a ludicrous amount of HP, making fights artificially take much longer than they need to. Even random enemies at the same level as you can have almost triple a party's member's health. Sadly, none of those enemies are varied or interesting enough to make the long battles stay fun the whole time. They tend to run around and use a few different basic attacks and maybe a spell or two, but it gets old fast. That being said, you do have up to 4 party members in a fight, all throwing big attacks around, so it's not as bad later on as it is in the early game. Regardless of how much you like the combat, having it take twice as long as it should is going to get on your nerves at some point, and combat is going to lose a fair amount of its luster. That's just the normal enemies though. I haven't even completely ruined the boss fights for you yet. The first main boss fight you fight is the Renin Lord of Fire, Balseph. Because he is a humanoid character who can cast spells, he's pretty similar to fighting like another party character. This is really cool and a design choice I personally really enjoy. Boss fights are meant to be a test of skill that you've learned so far, and what better way to test those skills than to have someone like you using them against you. Dark Souls does this concept really well, and the Abyss Watchers are still one of my favorite bosses in the whole series. But, of course, Tales of Arise misses the mark by making the amateur mistake of boss has too much HP and can one-shot you, instead of making an actually difficult fight that feels rewarding to navigate. Boss fights can be broken down into 3 main issues. First, they have so much HP, it's almost a parody of RPG games as a whole. At this point in the game, you're about level 8 and have around 500 HP each. This fight takes place with just Alphen and Xion, so you have 1000 HP to work with between the two characters, and whatever healing items you found along with Xion's heals. How much HP does Balseph have? I've already told you that's crazy high, so you're probably thinking something along the times of 8 times my party's health? Maybe 10,000 HP? Nope. Balseph has a ball-crunchingly high HP pool of 19,000. He has almost 20 times your party's HP. I would say it takes about 4 minutes of beating on him just to enter phase 2. Thankfully, if you enter phase 2 of this fight, you restart from there if you die. Phase 2 happens at half HP, so you get some progress, permanently if you get to that point in it. Issue 2 is bosses deal way too much damage for how long these fights last. Boss attacks always do a lot of damage, even the faster ones that you can't react to easily. Plenty of bosses will outright kill the player in one hit. You might say it's a skill issue, and I'm inclined to agree with you for the most part, but let me ask you this. How many times in a row can I ask you to dodge a slow attack before you mess up and get hit anyway? These boss battles take so long that even if the one-shot attacks are slow and obvious, they do the attacks so many times you're bound to mess up at least once or twice. And not only that, you don't control all 4 party members at once, so sometimes the boss winds up and splats a character you're not even playing as. No fault of your own, but now you're down a member and have to use an item or a spell to revive them. The third main issue is the bosses don't have enough unique attacks and tactics to keep the fights interesting. Bosses cycle through the same few attacks and never use any tactics like bosses in more refined combat systems do. They don't dodge back when you're attacking them, they don't play aggressively if you give them an opening. The combination of how little feedback you get for hitting them along with their simplistic attack patterns means the fight feels completely hollow. You don't feel like you're fighting a real opponent who wants to defeat you, just a mindless puppet going through the motions on the fight. None of the bosses felt fun to fight, and I never got a sense of accomplishment for beating them. I can't feel smart or skilled beating an enemy who they themselves don't have any skill or wit. Speaking of skill, let's go ahead and remove that from my end as well. One of the many factors that play into the balancing of a game's combat system is how impactful damage is to the player. Some games let you shrug off damage if you haven't taken a hit for a few seconds, while others will require specific items to be used. There isn't one right answer, it all depends on the game around it to provide context. If you're playing a gritty, realistic sandbox survival game, you're expecting a system where broken bones need more than a bandage to heal. Tales of Arise is a combat system where players are gonna get hurt a lot. Enemies attack fast and hit hard while the main character's special attack costs health to use. If the game is too stingy with healing, it would seem overly punishing and you wouldn't be incentivized to use blazing sword techniques if you're sticking to playing as Alphen. Tales of Arise decides to give you plenty of heals and even a revive, but they balance it around a system called cure points. See, unlike most RPGs, Tales of Arise doesn't have a traditional mana system. Instead, casting spells and using abilities cost AG, which recovers quickly during combat. Since the amount of spells you can cast is essentially uncapped, they needed a way to balance the healing spells or else the enemies could never party wipe you. After all, combat doesn't end until all characters in the battle die, so even if the one you're playing as dies, you can just swap to another one. So the game uses a meter called Cure Points that refill when the party rests at an inn or a camp. The spells that heal or revive party members have an additional cost to Cure Points, so there's a limiter on the amount of healing you can use. In a way, it's similar to the Estus Flask in Dark Souls. It's an unlimited resource that's limited in fights as a way to both let you have as much as you need of it throughout the game, but it can't be abused in combat. If a player wasn't limited by cure points, all combat would become significantly easier. So long as no one attack killed the entire party, they could heal and keep going, slowly draining the boss's HP until they eventually won the war of attrition. If done with enough patience, this tactic would entirely invalidate the difficulty of the game's combat. It would sure be a crying shame if the game completely missed the point of its own systems and included a nearly infinite cure points loop that made all boss fights meaningless. Something literary device. One of the items introduced early in the game is Orange Gel, which restores 30% of your cure points. Why they even introduced an item like this is beyond me. It completely serves to undermine the entire balancing decision behind cure points at all. Either the amount of cure points we can take into battle is an important number we need to keep track of, or it's just a mild inconvenience that doesn't add any strategy to the battle. If orange gels were a difficult to obtain, limited resource we had to specifically save for dire situations, I could see the reason for its inclusion. But once you beat the second Lord, the game allows you to buy as many as you want throughout the entire game. The game limits you to 15 in your inventory at once, but since that's equal to 5 entire extra bars, it's basically a non-factor. Combine this with the life bottle, an item that revives one ally, to make sure Xion is always up to cast more revives. Past this point, it's nearly impossible to lose a fight you know is coming because you can always farm weak enemies for a bit and get the gold to buy 15 orange shells and life bottles. This kind of loop should have been caught fairly early on by playtesters, but for whatever reason, it made it into the final game. Look, we can discuss the combat for another 2 hours, roughly the length of a boss fight, but I want to break off into another direction. See, it's not only the buttons you click while in combat that determine how good that combat is. Progression mechanics outside of combat, like weapons and upgrades, learning new spells, and other similar systems, can play a large role in how we view the combat in RPG games. Even if a game has good combat, boring and linear progression mechanics can still dull the experience. It's harder to be invested in an RPG combat system if you don't feel engaged by the ways you make your character stronger. Being able to build a character in different ways, or the ability to focus on obtaining rare and unique equipment, all impact your experience in the fights themselves. Let's start with the good. The title and upgrade mechanics are pretty cool. To unlock a title, you do certain tasks like fish 10 times or down 35 enemies with boost attacks. Some of these titles are unlocked by beating certain story missions, so you will always make some progress as you play through the game normally. These give you one free upgrade, such as increasing how much boost you get from downing an enemy. Then it will have 4 to 5 upgrades you can unlock with skill points. You acquire skill points after battles and side quests, so you're encouraged to do some other content besides the main story. Each character has their own titles and skills to unlock, making this a pretty fun system to look into and build the characters how you want them. Speaking of builds, equipment is laughably shallow. Each character can only use one type of weapon and armor. There is no strategy when it comes to which characters get which equipment because they don't overlap whatsoever. The weapons and armor Alphen uses can only be used for Alphen, so on and so forth. The way to obtain weapons and armor is super bland. Armor is either purchased or found in the levels and dungeons, weapons are crafted at shops and sometimes found in areas. A new weapon or a piece of armor, 99% of the time, is a direct upgrade in all stats to the previous one. There's no trade-off whatsoever, so there's no strategy. You either take the time to grind the best equipment for the character, or say good enough and move on to the next area. The weapons and armor don't have any unique effects or skills associated with them either, just stat increases and which elements they buff, if any. You can't possibly think critically about which weapons or armor to use, because they just have higher numbers than each other and nothing interesting to set them apart. The closest thing to variety for equipment is the accessory slot. You can mine ores around the map to make different accessories that give buffs like fire damage minus 50% or immune to poison. These can also be upgraded to add extra buffs. Any character can equip any one of these, so you can at least make decisions on which character will get which buffs and customize them in that way. If the weapons and armor provided such buffs, I would have liked the systems much more, even if they stayed simplified. There is nothing wrong with a simplified system if it still provides some level of choice and customizability. If I had to use one word to describe Tales of Arise's combat, it would be superficial. Sure, it looks nice, it can even be dumb fun from time to time, but it never elevates itself into a deep and worthwhile experience because its oversimplified systems don't leave much room for engagement. There are only so many ways to approach combat when the entire challenge is, this boss has 70 times your entire party's HP, how do you proceed? And barely anything outside the fight has any bearing inside the fight, so you can't look for interesting options there. Fights take too long, enemies aren't varied enough, weapons and armors are boring, and I had to Google synonyms for lacking depth to come up with superficial.